On today's World Insight, as a new U.S. administration comes in, what is the foreign policy legacy Joe Biden leaves behind? And what might we expect from 4 more years of Donald Trump?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. On January the 13th, U.S. President Joe Biden delivers a foreign policy address at the State Department, outlining the achievements of his foreign policy strategy just 1 week before Donald Trump takes office. Meanwhile, amid the recent wildfires in Los Angeles, California, Trump has criticized the Governor Newsom and the Biden administration, accusing them of severe incompetence and mismanagement. In response, Biden emphasized that the disaster should not be politicized. In this critical period of power transition in Washington, what do all of these divisions domestically mean for the U.S. governance? And what might be the implications for the rest of the world? Let's hear from our panelists from different parts of the world. Joining us in Singapore, James Dorsey, adjunct senior fellow at Singapore's Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and also in Berlin, Ulrich Bruckner, Monnet Professor for European Studies from Stanford University. In Beijing, Rong Ying, Senior Research Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, we are seeing the end of the Biden administration in less than 10 days, the transition to another new administration, though many people term it as Trump 2.0. At this point, what do you make of the nature of this transition? How is your part of the world looking at it? Is Biden administration a great success?
I think it depends on what part of the world you're talking about. Certainly in the Middle East, he is not viewed as a success. And certainly in the last 15 months with the various Middle East wars, particularly the one in Gaza. That is to say that the Middle East doesn't necessarily look at Donald Trump as the answer, but they do feel that in a number of respects, Trump is going to be a better president for them than Biden was. But then again, I think you need to look at specific issues. The Israelis obviously have hope that their policies and ambitions are going to be endorsed by the Trump administration. That would include confronting Iran militarily in terms of its nuclear program. It would include harsher, if that's possible, harsher operations in Gaza. And that's something that many of the Arab states find very problematic.
During the foreign policy speech, I'm sure the president of the United States would touch on how stronger America is in foreign policy. He handed over to Donald Trump than he received from Donald Trump years ago. I'm sure he would. I'm sure that the issue of how America has been strengthened, quote unquote, would be mentioned many times, and as well, America in the so-called driver's seats would be pretty much in the rhetorics of foreign policy by this administration. After all, it's usually the practice in the U.S. To celebrate at the end of the term, no matter what. So, Mr. Dorsey, are these rhetorics really results that you see on the ground?
Well, I think that Biden may not be totally wrong. That is to say that I think you've got to differentiate in terms of what part of the world, and you've got to differentiate between public opinion and what elites may believe. Fact of the matter is that we talk a lot about loss of credibility, for example, in the Middle East. But at the same time, the Gulf states look to the United States for their defense and for their security. They don't look elsewhere, irrespective of the fact that they're unhappy with the support that the Biden administration and Biden himself has given to the Israelis, particularly in Gaza. So I think it's a very mixed bag in which there's some truth in it. It's not absolutely correct, but it's also not absolutely false.
Mr. Rong, from your part of the world, Asia, particularly Northeast Asia, and particularly China, which the current Biden administration termed as rivalry, competitor, to say the least. What is your assessment?
Looking back for the past 4 years, I think China would like to see the Biden administration would have done more in terms of playing a role of stabilization and extend sort of provide stability for this region. After all, the past decades since the end of Cold War have seen the region enjoy continuously peace, stability, and prosperity. And this is very much thanks to the largely cooperative relationship between China and the United States and among the major countries in the region.
I think it's fair to say that Biden is the last transatlantic president. We have a different composition of the demography in the United States. There are less people with a European background, and Biden clearly had a European root with his feelings towards Ireland and his understanding of the limitations and the restrictions of various European politicians. So I think we miss him already, and it will be very difficult to find a position that is in Europeans' interest, and that makes a lot of people worried. When you look at the concrete conflicts, Biden could have done more to support Zelensky to win, and he was either not willing or fearing the risk that this could turn into a third world war. What is happening in the Middle East has already pointed out by my colleague. So the record is complicated, to say the least.
I agree with what Professor Bruckner said. I want to make one caveat on that, though. And I think that if you compare the administration that Trump is putting together now as to the administration that he had in his first term, for certain, this is much more an administration of fealty, of loyalty, but it's also in some ways a more consistent administration. Certainly when it comes to the Middle East, where you see in the top tier almost uniformity in terms of Iran hawks and his pro-Israeli hardliners. I also think that you're seeing something else, and which is, whereas my colleague is right that Trump is not a strategic thinker, he's a very emotive, but we're also seeing in bits and pieces that he's learned lessons from the first administration, and we may not see the kind of chaos and not quite the shooting from the hip that we saw in the first administration.
The Biden administration, as pretty much some of you already termed, as golden middle way. He doesn't go to one extreme nor to the other, and therefore not satisfy everybody or any one specific group. But on the other hand, how much has been achieved in a way will be very interesting, especially at this time of transition. In other words, what his administration did, how much can be expected currently and in the future?
Well, when I look from the perspective of transatlantic relations, then a lot has been achieved because Biden and his team are very committed to multilateralism, the rule of law. He's reliable. He uses diplomatic tactics and diplomatic strategies to get the work done. And he managed to guide the United States into a very prosperous future. When you look at the comparison of how GDP developed in Europe compared with the United States, then the United States is far ahead. So from that perspective, there are a lot of achievements from this administration, and the Europeans are very happy to have someone who understands them, who listens to them, and he trusts in international organizations and specifically the Transatlantic Alliance. Without the United States, things would have been far worse, given the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine.
You talk about the rule of law. We understand from the very beginning of the Biden administration and until today, it has been talking about a rule-based international system. But given the fact that even though the Biden administration rejoined some of the international organizations or platforms. It's not necessarily, one could argue, a strong support of international system, including WTO, including United Nations, and the list goes on. So besides rhetoric, what about the real performance, especially about the rules-based international system, which means not just the US benefits, but also all the others could benefit as a result?
It is, on the one hand, the rhetoric of believing in multilateralism and using international organizations for American interests. I think this is the common denominator of all institutions and all administrations in the past, that there is a certain form of America first, and we live still under a Pax Americana, an international order that has been formatted when the United States were the most dominant force after World War II, which is no longer the world we live in. So on that background, it is, of course, something that the rest of the world would have liked to see being promoted by the United States more, to make it more balanced and more fair, so to speak. But if we compare what Biden did and what he talked about and how he supported different ideas, then we got much more compared with the 4 years of Trump. And therefore, given that the checks and balances in the upcoming administration are less functioning, and Trump also learned from the failures of the past, things do not look promising.
Professor Bruckner, about that transatlantic relationship is very much a focus of the Biden administration. I think everyone who have been looking at the world's politics over the past few years certainly understand the point you're making. But on the other hand, we also see groupings of countries being tagged, for example, about quote-unquote democracy vis-a-vis authoritarian. That is certainly a rhetoric slogan coming out of the Biden administration. We also see bringing several countries, throw them into one kind of a club by rhetorics, suggesting the rest of the world are otherwise. That reminds me of a very interesting and traditional way of easy international politics, which is adversary, which is antagonist branding. Sometimes it is one side toward the other, sometimes it's mutually so. So how do you see that has been played out over the past 4 years? And is that also likely to be the nature of this transition we are witnessing right now?
Well, you're right with this observation, but as Mr. Dorsey says already, when we ask a normative question, it depends on the norm that we apply. And for some, it looks like a success, and for others, it was a big relief that finally someone who speaks our language in Europe is the president in the White House. So from a European perspective, the commitment to the rule of law, to Western principles, to market economy, to see climate change as a major challenge, and to be loyal and supportive if there is a conflict on the edge of the NATO countries. Yeah. This was something that was perceived with great relief. And what we now see, that not only the incoming president and his rhetoric is attacking a lot of these values and principles, but also players who are not even part of the American administration. We saw a few days ago in Germany an interview of the head of the right-wing party Alternative für Deutschland with Elon Musk. And the clear message is that disruption is the only thing that helps, and European institutions should be dismantled, and the only one who could save Germany is a right-wing party. So none of this looks promising, and it is so close to the incoming president that there are all the reasons to worry.
Mr. Dorsey, on that part, what is your take? Are we being invited ever closer to the door of another Cold War if antagonist behaviors and policies and rhetorics were pretty much the characteristics of the Cold War that we experienced over the past decades?
I think we're certainly looking at a world of greater polarization. And following up on what Professor Bruckner said, I think one legacy of the Biden administration is going to be governments, states have always had contradictions in their policies, have always applied double standards. That's true for the United States as it is for many other governments. But in many ways, one legacy of the Biden administration, certainly in significant segments of the international community, may not necessarily be in all of the international community, is one of double standards on steroids, and the perception of the difference in approach and policies towards Ukraine as opposed towards Gaza. And I think that's going to be one legacy of the Biden administration, that when the Trump administration comes in, irrespective of what one thinks of the policies, is in some ways, far more straightforward and honest.
Let me move on to another question, because right now, during this transition, everybody is looking at the big fire in California. Is such a sad thing, because the fire just keep on spreading and people's lives are, as a result, impacted tremendously. Our condolences certainly to those who have lost their lives and their families and or their properties. But some suggest that this has already become such a political issue, especially during the transition of administration. Mr. Dorsey, how do you look at the kind of kicking the ball to one another about what to do on this crisis, especially on the common folks' lives and their properties these days? Many are really concerned about, people's daily issues in that region, in fact.
Well, first of all, I think that both the transition in 2016 from to the first Trump administration, as well as the transition that we're seeing now, are among the most hostile transitions that we've seen. And I think what we're seeing in California with President-elect Trump's response is a weaponizing and politicizing of an issue in which there should be far more cooperation, far more empathy, far more compassion, rather than trying to score points here.
There were criticism against the California governor. There was criticism against the Democrat Party. But what do you think if you were, among those that they consulted for policies at this time of the transition? What does it take, at least from the governance perspective, to do as much as possible to deal with the current crisis for the sake of the common folks? What do you think might be the reasonable things to do?
Clearly support by the federal government. And whatever issues there are on policies and differences that may be legitimate are issues that should really be handled once this is gotten under control. Right now is not at a moment at which you have fires burning and expanding, people's lives at risk, enormous material damage that's going to raise questions for the real estate market in the United States for years to come. Yeah. Given the insurance issues involved here, this is not the moment to be trying to score points, in my mind.
Mr. Rong, many would wonder, observing from afar, China looking at the situation over there during this transition, the problems and the internal political fights. How is China being termed as an opponent or a competitor of the United States? Read all of this.
Well, certainly China does not want to be the defining sort of issue or defining or the designated sort of adversary or rival for United States. And this has always been, I think, the issue, the question facing the relationship, particularly in the past few years. As we are looking at the expecting the transition, China would hope that the second term administration of Trump will take a different perspective. And I think both China and the United States and the world at large has a huge stake for stable and predictable relationship. But of course, China is very much ready to manage or to deal with whatever eventuality would come out, or whatever policies the second administration of Trump will do. And that is, again, a very clear and loud message China has been sending out.
Mr. Dorsey, over the past few years, we certainly noticed one interesting phenomenon out of the Biden administration foreign policy, pretty much putting supply chains and artificial intelligence and etc. issues into the foreign policy package. That, of course, was not necessarily the case for most of the earlier administrations. Do you see that kind of tendency will continue? What does that mean for the tasks of transition for both administrations as a result?
I don't know that it necessarily is going to mean something for the transition itself. There's obviously one good reason why this is playing a much greater role than it has in the past, and that is the development of the technology itself that was not as developed in past administrations. The other thing to look at with the incoming Trump administration is, of course, the influence that very prominent tech entrepreneurs, Elon Musk was already mentioned, Peter Thiel, there are various others, their influence and impact on the Trump administration, I think is going to be part of what drives the focus on technology.
What about supply chains? It certainly has become a huge part of the foreign policy package. Will that be the legacy continue for the next administration? Mr. Dorsey.
I think there's no doubt about it. I mean, what you saw under globalization was offshoring. With other words, the move of manufacturing of companies to economies and legal environments that were more conducive. What you're seeing with the concept of Make America Great Again is an effort to onshoring. And one of the interesting questions in that is going to be how China figures into that onshoring.
Is it only China, but also others?
It's definitely others, but China is obviously a heavyweight in supply chains, and therefore, and because of all the sensitivities, the political issues, a major factor, but clearly it's also others.
Professor Bruckner, what do you make of that? Are some of the most important achievements of U.S. foreign policy China-targeted or antagonistic China-oriented? For example, reflected by supply chains and also AI policies?
Well, Europe and Germany in particular, as an export-based economy, suffers a lot from the return of protectionism, because we got rich because of globalization, and we both benefited, China and Germany or the European Union as a whole, from functioning supply chain management. And now with the reintroduction of protectionist instrument, this is not only an unfavorable environment, but it directly harmed a number of productions and the onshoring that was also triggered by big initiatives like the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States that was labeled as if it is supposed to reduce inflation, but it's first and foremost a climate change project. This had serious effects. And although I praised the good relations between the United States and the European Union, this was something that we didn't see coming and that had a lot of negative consequences. Now having a government in the United States that is not even believing that climate change is real, although what we have just discussed with the fires in California highlights that there is a man-made effect on the intensity of natural catastrophes. This all doesn't sound promising, and there will be harms on the economy. And it also sounds as if the president-elect doesn't have great advisors, because if he does what he announces, it will also negatively affect growth in the United States and will further destroy or at least affect the functioning of supply chains around the world.
I see. Now, when we judge, how things have been, whether policies are successful, whether one administration is welcomed, should be remembered, the nature of the legacy. Probably people have to ask many questions by looking at the result. For example, is the world safer? For example, are we get richer, all of us, or at least most of us? For example, is the world order getting better for most of us? For example, are the technology benefiting most of us? And the list goes on. These are just humble questions I thought about before our interview today, but I'm sure our audience have their better list of questions when looking at legacy of one administration or one government. Certainly today is only a start of discussion about this transition. We'll have more to watch and to comment on. I want to thank all of you to join us today. James Dorsey, Ulrich Bruckner, Rong Ying. Appreciate it. Thank you. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. And I'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.